"You will not force a man from his room." The voice came from behind the half-open door. Richard Haines was 32. He stood in the corridor with a file. He wore the clean badge of procedure and a tired certainty. Arthur Blythe was 83. He opened the door slow, a man measured by refusal rather than speech. The flat was spare. A chair, a small table, a single black and white photograph hung over the mantel. The photograph showed a sergeant beside a private. Neat script beneath naming the private Haines. Richard stepped forward and offered the eviction notice like a folded law. He kept his voice clipped and correct. Arthur placed his palm on the doorframe and did not move it. He did not protest the paper, only the idea. "You will not force a man from his room," he said again, not loud, as if speaking into a ledger. Neighbors leaned behind curtains. A child left a toy half-held. The block listened like wood that remembers weight. Richard read the clause aloud, the words mechanical, his hand steady on the paper. He asked for a signature. Arthur looked at the form, then at the photograph, his fingers resting on the frame, the tremor small and contained. "That name," he said, and waited for the young man to answer. Richard felt a shift. The surname was thin and stubborn in his mouth. He had not expected that particular weight. He asked who that was in the picture, and Arthur only nodded toward the sergeant as if pointing at an old wound. Richard tried the procedure again. Procedural steps, like a march. He asked the neighbor to witness. He spoke into the margin of rules. Arthur laughed once, low and dry, and his laugh did not make light. The laugh tightened the hallway into new lines. Richard stopped. He noticed the sergeant's ribbons in the photograph, faint as pencil, and the private's face too young for casualty. A small thing, a label taped inside the folder at his elbow, slid from his memory like a coin. He did not know why it mattered yet. He moved to leave the flat to fetch a pen. The eviction was not signed. The paper stayed white and waiting. At the doorway, Richard hesitated and read the room like a man reading a long, thin cable of evidence. He pictured the office and the locked rows of files, the little brass labels that meant weight and secrecy. In the van, he slid open a drawer to check a stamp and caught sight of a typed sticker on the file's inner flap. "Operation Iron Wind, Major Arthur Blythe," it read, the letters neat and sealed. Richard felt the paper go heavier in his hand. He closed the drawer and breathed once, the breath a small concession. He walked back toward the block and carried with him a new question. He kept the eviction notice folded, the signature line unmoved, and returned to a door where a photograph already held the answer he did not yet understand. Richard closed the door behind him and walked with the eviction tucked under his arm, the paper warm from his hand. He had the van to clear, the desk to return to, the boxes of files that made the ministry a patient cemetery. At the office, the archive smelled of card and ink. He slid the folder onto a metal table and found the inner flap where stamps hid. "Operation Iron Wind, Major Arthur Blythe," the label said, neat and official as a verdict. He did not expect the name to fit the flat. He opened the file and read handwriting that was not neat. A human scroll with corrections, saved entire Haines unit. One line began, then names, then one crossed through. Richard felt the room narrow. His breath sounded too loud in the quiet. He checked a roster on the same page, and the name George Haines stared back. Listed KIA. The listing should have been final, boxed and filed. But the paper had a fold where an extra name had been added. He called a colleague in records and asked for a restricted drawer. He did not explain the sudden tightness in his chest. The colleague passed a microfilm roll, a thin strip of time, the kind of thing that turned people into careful readers. The microfilm showed a report typed in the old way, margins tight, orders stamped confidential. There was a line at the end, handwritten in different ink. "Mercy overrides command," it read, and the signature was a name Richard now knew by sight. He folded the paper and felt the edges like a city of small decisions. He thought of his mother and the way she had never said much about the war. He remembered a dinner where a name stopped the conversation. and a child who had meant nothing by that name and everything by it later. Richard went back to the block faster than he had left. The eviction notice, still folded in his breast pocket, felt like a thing that belonged to someone else. Arthur sat in his chair and watched him, as if they had both been waiting for the same footstep. Richard placed the file on the small table and did not speak at first. He let the photograph have its hour. Then he asked, "What was Operation Iron Wind?" Arthur named it a campaign, a string of moves, and then he said the words he had said before. "You will not force a man from his room." Richard laid the microfilm print on top of the photograph, the two papers bright against the wood. He watched Arthur look and look away. Arthur did not explain. He tapped the frame with a finger and nodded toward the sergeant in the picture, as if that answered more than any file could. Neighbors had gathered at doors now, a low clatter of concern. The block closed itself around the room like a hand. Richard kept the eviction folded, but he did not ask for a signature. He had a different duty now, one that would not be satisfied by a name on a line. He carried the microfilm like a private thing and sat at the archive table with a light that made the paper look honest. The roll unspooled and threw up names in neat columns, and Richard followed each like a soldier counting steps. The report was old type and older ink, the sort that made omissions look deliberate. One paragraph listed transfers and exits. The next had a typed line sealed confidential. Then a different hand had written across the margin, "Mercy overrides command," the ink said, sharp and small, as if it had been added afterwards. Richard read the signature and felt his chest loosen and tighten at once. The man who had signed was Major Arthur Blythe. He thought of his father differently now, not as a neat abbreviation on a casualty list, but as a name that had been moved. Names on the roster sat like stones, and one stone had a notch where something had been shifted. Richard took a copy and crossed the office to records. He set the print on a clerk's desk and asked for the original operational dispatches. The clerk brought a thin brown envelope from a locked drawer and placed it between them, the paper soft with handling. The dispatches showed a manifest, and beside one entry, someone had written an alternative name in pencil. George Haines was listed as KIA, yet the pencil had added "moved to safe list," a small correction with large consequences. Richard felt his hands go numb and the office shrink around him. He returned to the block with the envelope, like evidence. Neighbors watched from doorways. A woman held a knitting in silent hands. Richard asked aloud the question he had never asked his mother. Who made that call? Arthur folded his hands and tapped the frame of the photograph. He did not hurry his answer. "I chose," he said simply, and it sounded like a verdict. Richard braced, the word choice like a lever, and the room leaned in. He had expected denial, not confession, and that omission felt like a wound. Arthur continued, "There was an order to prioritize rank. I broke it. I moved names, and some died who might have lived. The admission split everything into duty and mercy, and Richard felt both as accusation." He pointed at the photograph, and Arthur named the private George, the name that had become his father's shadow. Richard felt the room tilt, the discovery making private history public. He folded the dispatches as if closing a wound, and he could see how the file's neatness had hidden a deliberate stain. Arthur looked at him with a tired clarity. "I saved a unit," he said, "and sometimes that means choices you carry." Richard did not answer, because the answer would be a balance of lives he could not weigh. He left the flat with the envelope between his hands and the photograph watching him go. Outside, the block held its breath, and Richard knew one question would lead to another he was not ready to ask. He walked to the stairwell and paused, thinking of his mother's silence and the taste of a secret kept too long. The envelope felt heavier than paper. He walked back to the block with the envelope heavy in his hands. Neighbors clustered at doorways, whispers like small hammers. A military vehicle pulled up, its engine a respectful hum. An admiral in uniform stepped down and walked to number 12 with a formal gait. Word ran along the corridor, and the block opened like a book. People stood at thresholds, eyes wide, mouths shut. as if the presence imposed a new attention. Richard felt suddenly small in his suit, the file and envelope like weight. He met the Admiral at the door. The man saluted Arthur as if the room were a chapel. Admiral Sinclair spoke, his voice even and old. "Major Blythe, the Crown remembers," he said, and remembered landed like a small bell. Arthur did not rise. He raised one thin hand in salute and kept his eyes on the photograph. The Admiral lowered his head, the motion brief and burdened. A neighbor whispered about medals and banners, a ceremony to mend the past. Richard listened and felt the suggestions bump against the envelope in his hand. The Admiral named the campaign aloud, Operation Iron Wind. He said the state wished to acknowledge debts long unpaid. He opened a case and laid out a citation, a paper trying to make a life tidy. He placed it and looked to Arthur. Arthur tapped the photograph and shook his head once. "Absolute. I do not want that," he said, and the words made a new rule. The Admiral reached as if to offer the ceremony, and spoke of honor and recompense. Arthur pointed to the sergeant in the picture, as if that answered more than a medal could. Richard felt the refusal as accusation, his uniform suddenly inadequate. He heard the Admiral offer an apology, the sort of apology that carried the years between signatures. The Admiral's hands trembled with the memory of choices made, in rooms with less light. He said he had signed papers long ago, and that files were sealed to protect the living. Arthur pressed a fist to his mouth, as if to hold the past down. He said he had moved names, that mercy had a cost, and he would carry that cost alone. Neighbors murmured, a low tide of pity and outrage. A woman by the stair wiped her eyes, a man steadying his breath. Richard thought of his mother and the silence at the dinner table. He tightened his grip on the envelope, feeling its edges like a ledger of lives. The Admiral stepped back and let the room decide what to do with the apology. The ceremony hung unfinished between the medals and the photograph. People looked from face to face, some inclined to applause, others to quiet. Richard folded the envelope and kept it pressed to his chest, and the block waited. He had asked where mercy had come from, and now he had seen the men who had kept it hidden. The question remained whether Arthur would accept the state's apology, or keep the truth as his own to bear. He returned with the envelope and the printouts like a burden folded into paper. The block had gathered itself into a small audience, hush threaded between doorframes and stairwells. Richard laid the dispatches on the table and did not explain. Arthur watched the papers as if reading back a life in someone else's hand. There was a tape among the files, a brittle strip with handwriting on a label. Richard pressed play on a small recorder, and the voice was younger, firm, deliberate. "Do it," the voice said. "Let the Haines unit go." Silence held the sentence like a coin in a palm. Richard felt the room tip. The admission in ink met the admission in voice, and they fit together with a sound like breaking. Arthur folded his hands and looked at the photograph as if it were a ledger closed on purpose. "Who signed?" Richard asked, the question sudden and raw. Arthur named the officer, then shook his head and said he had signed too. "I chose," he said, and he said it without ceremony, as if the choice had been counted like rations. People nearby drew breath like a crowd at confession. The tape kept running. It spoke of orders and priorities, of ranks to shield and lists to seal. It spoke of a moment when a hand moved a name and a life was set aside for another form of safety. Richard swallowed. He thought of a childhood meal and a silence that had been ordinary until now. He thought of his mother not answering questions and the way the table had folded away from the subject like a wound. Admiral Sinclair stepped forward and spoke, his voice carrying the long weight of signatures. "I authorized the seals," he said. "And I thought it right once," he added. Apology flat like a report. Arthur did not accept medals or words. He tapped the photograph and said he had saved a unit, not a man. He said he had written another name into a list and left one name to the ledger of war. The revelation did not simplify into grievance or gratitude. It multiplied into a field of moral shards. Neighbors murmured, some muttering about justice, others about mercy. their voices small and human against an old, bureaucratic machinery. Richard folded the eviction notice at last and let it fall into his palm like something with no claim. He walked to Arthur and put the folded paper on the table between the photograph and the tape. "I will not evict you," he said, the sentence soft and exact. Arthur looked at Richard long enough for the younger man to feel the years pass in one glance. The Admiral offered a formal hand, words arranged to tidy the past, and Arthur took the hand with 2 fingers. The handshake was not triumph. It was acknowledgement, a small instrument of closure. The block stood to one another, like a jury without verdict. And then they did something older. They accepted that ritual and truth need not be the same. A neighbor produced a new caption on a scrap of card and pinned it beneath the photograph. Handwriting careful, the words simple and final. "He saved them all," the card read, and people read the card out loud in the hush. Richard felt a grief that was not solely his, and a relief that was not solely his, folded together like paper that will not lie flat. Arthur straightened in his chair, and for the first time in years, he let his shoulders loose a little. He said nothing more about blame. He said only that names were work to be done, and some men carried it alone. As people drifted back behind their doors, the Admiral lingered and then left without ceremony. The file remained. The tape was copied and sealed in a new envelope, and Richard carried the small weight of proof like a new compass. He stepped outside and paused at the threshold, looking at number 12 as if seeing it whole for the first time. The photograph hung with a new caption. The pocket of the block eased, and Richard realized some stories end in public ritual, while others end in a quiet that asks to be kept alive. So here's the question that haunts me. Was Arthur right to break orders and save Richard's father? He saved lives. Yes, but others died because of his choice. There's no clean answer, is there? That's what makes this story so powerful. Drop a comment and tell me what you think. Mercy or duty? Which would you choose if this made you feel something? Share it. Subscribe if you want more stories that make you think rather than just feel good. Because life isn't about easy choices. It's about living with the hard ones. Right then. See you next time.